The scent of roasted turkey and cinnamon hung heavy in the air, a familiar perfume of Thanksgiving that, for Eleanor, felt more like a warning than a welcome. Every year, she and Liam made the 2-hour drive to his parents' house, and every year a knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach, pulling taut the moment their car turned onto the familiar suburban street. This year was no different. Liam, sensing her unease, placed a reassuring hand on her knee. "It'll be okay, Elle. Just be yourself." That was the problem, wasn't it? Being herself had never been quite good enough for his mother, Margaret. Margaret's house was a shrine to a specific brand of domestic perfection. The carpets were flawlessly vacuumed, the silverware gleamed under the warm lights of the dining room chandelier, and every decorative gourd and autumn leaf seemed to be placed with geometric precision. It was a home that felt less lived in and more curated, a standard Eleanor felt she was constantly failing to meet. "Eleanor, dear," Margaret greeted her at the door, her smile as crisp as the autumn air. She offered a cheek for a kiss that felt more like an inspection. Her eyes, sharp and discerning, flickered over Eleanor's simple dress. "That's a modern choice for Thanksgiving." "It's nice to see you too, Margaret," Eleanor replied, forcing a smile of her own. Liam's father, a quiet man named Arthur, gave her a warm, genuine hug, a small gesture of kindness that felt like a lifeline. The heart of the home, and the center of Margaret's power, was the kitchen. It was a vast, immaculate space, and Margaret moved through it like a general commanding her troops. She single-handedly prepared a feast that could feed a small army, and she made sure everyone knew it. Help was not only rejected, it was treated as an insult, a suggestion that she was somehow incapable. Eleanor had once made the mistake of trying to help wash dishes. Margaret had gently but firmly taken the sponge from her hand, saying, "Oh, you don't need to worry about that, dear. I have a system." This year, Eleanor had decided to contribute a dish, a delicate pumpkin mousse with crystallized ginger she had spent the previous evening perfecting. It was light, complex, and a point of personal pride. She placed the glass bowl on the crowded sideboard, hoping it might be a small bridge between them. Margaret glanced at it later, her brow furrowing slightly. "What's this, Eleanor? A pudding?" "It's a pumpkin mousse," Eleanor explained. "I thought it would be a nice, lighter alternative to pie." "Oh," Margaret said, the single syllable carrying a weight of dismissal. "Well, I have my traditional apple and pecan pies, of course. People expect that." She then turned her back, returning to basting the turkey with a focus so intense it left no room for further conversation. The mousse sat on the sideboard, untouched and seemingly forgotten. Dinner was a tense affair. The conversation was stilted, revolving mostly around Margaret's acquaintances and their accomplishments. Liam tried to steer the topic toward things he and Eleanor were excited about, their recent trip, a project at his work, but Margaret always found a way to bring it back to her own orbit. Through it all, Eleanor felt like a spectator. She smiled, she nodded, she passed the gravy, but she felt invisible. The main course plates were cleared, and the moment for dessert arrived. Margaret proudly presented her 2 pies, perfectly browned and latticed. As expected, they were served to resounding praise. Eleanor watched as her own dessert bowl remained on the sideboard, a silent testament to her failed attempt at connection. She felt a familiar sting of inadequacy, the quiet, persistent feeling that she simply didn't belong in this family, in this house. She was an outsider who had married in, but had never truly been let in. And as Margaret prepared to cut the second pie, she finally turned her attention, and the attention of the entire table, toward Eleanor. Margaret placed the half-cut apple pie on the table, wiping her hands on her pristine apron. She surveyed her family, a queen overseeing her court, her gaze finally landing on Eleanor. There was a glint in her eye, a mix of pity and satisfaction that made Eleanor's blood run cold. "It's a shame, really," Margaret said, her voice light and conversational, yet carrying enough volume for everyone to hear clearly. She looked past Eleanor, addressing her son directly. "Liam, you always did love my home cooking. It's a good thing you have me to make you a proper meal now and then, isn't it?" She paused, letting the implication hang in the air, before turning her smile, now sharp as a knife's edge, back to Eleanor. Then came the blow, delivered with a soft, dismissive laugh. "She can't even cook." The words seemed to echo in the sudden silence of the room. It wasn't a shout, but it was as stunning as a slap. Arthur shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his gaze fixed on his empty plate. Eleanor could feel the heat rising in her cheeks. A flush of pure humiliation. It was one thing to be ignored, to have her contribution overlooked. It was another to be openly mocked in front of the entire family, reduced to a caricature of an incompetent wife. For years, she had endured Margaret's subtle digs and backhanded compliments, always telling herself it was better to keep the peace. But this was different. This was a deliberate, public execution of her worth. She opened her mouth to say something, anything, but the words caught in her throat. What could she say? Arguing would only make her seem defensive and petty, proving Margaret's point in her own mind. Just as the silence became unbearable, Liam placed his fork and knife down on his plate with a quiet, deliberate clink. The sound cut through the tension. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even look angry. He simply looked at his mother with a calm, steady gaze that was far more powerful than any outburst. "Actually, Mom," he said, his voice even and clear. "You're wrong about that." Margaret's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Wrong? Liam, darling, it was just a little joke. There's no need to be so sensitive on her behalf. We all know she's more of a career woman." The word was meant to sound like a compliment, but it was laced with the old-fashioned implication that it came at the expense of domestic skills. "No," Liam said, shaking his head slowly. "You're fundamentally wrong. Eleanor is the best cook I know." He then turned his head slightly and looked at the untouched bowl of mousse on the sideboard. "In fact, that mousse you wouldn't touch? It's the most popular dessert at her restaurant. The one that food critics have called a masterpiece of flavor and texture. The one people book reservations weeks in advance to taste." He let the words sink in. The air grew thick with confusion. Arthur looked up, his eyes wide with surprise, first at Liam, then at Eleanor. Margaret's face was a mask of utter disbelief. "Restaurant?" she stammered, her voice losing all of its previous confidence. "What are you talking about, Liam? That's absurd. She works in marketing, in an office downtown." It was then Eleanor realized the true depth of the chasm between them. Margaret didn't just disapprove of her, she knew nothing about her. She had never asked, never shown the slightest interest in her life beyond the superficial role of Liam's wife. "She quit that job over a year ago, Mom," Liam explained, his voice still quiet, but now infused with a steel Eleanor had rarely heard. "She took every penny of her savings, worked 18-hour days for months, and poured her entire soul into building her dream. The restaurant is called The Gilded Spoon. It's been open for 8 months, and it's not just surviving. It's one of the most successful and critically acclaimed new restaurants in the city. I'm not just her husband," he said, his voice softening with pride as he finally looked at Eleanor. "I'm her biggest fan." The room was utterly still. The Thanksgiving feast, the perfectly baked pies, the years of Margaret's undisputed reign over the kitchen, it all seemed to fade into the background. Margaret stood frozen, the pie server still clutched in her hand, her mouth slightly agape. The image of domestic perfection she had so carefully constructed had just been shattered by a truth she had never bothered to learn. And Eleanor, for the first time in that house, felt the knot in her stomach finally, blessedly, begin to unwind. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Margaret's face had gone pale, the rosy cheer from the wine and the heat of the kitchen completely drained away. She looked from Liam's resolute face to Eleanor's quiet composure, and then back again, as if searching for a crack in their story, a sign that this was some elaborate, cruel joke. But there was none. Why wouldn't you tell us?" Margaret finally whispered, the question directed at Liam but her wounded eyes fixed on Eleanor. The accusation of secrecy was her last defense, a shield against the mortifying realization that she had been not just wrong, but ignorant. "We did try," Liam said, his voice softer now, tinged with a hint of sadness. "A few times. Remember when I told you Elle was taking some advanced culinary classes last year? You said it was a cute hobby. When she quit her job to work on a new project, you told her it was irresponsible to leave a stable career. You never asked what it was. You just assumed." Each word was a gentle but firm rebuttal of Margaret's narrative. He wasn't just defending Eleanor. He was holding up a mirror to his mother, reflecting an image she clearly didn't want to see. It was Arthur who broke the heavy spell. He cleared his throat and set his napkin on the table, a look of slow-dawning wonder on his face. "A restaurant," he said, the words full of genuine awe. "Well, I'll be. Is that right, Eleanor? You're a chef?" Finding her voice, Eleanor nodded. The shame that had silenced her just moments before had been replaced by a quiet, steadying pride. "Yes, Arthur, I am." "That's wonderful," he boomed, a broad smile spreading across his face. "Simply wonderful. What kind of food do you make?" Before she could answer, Margaret interjected, a desperate attempt to regain some footing. "It's a terribly risky business, Arthur. Most new restaurants fail in the first year. The hours are dreadful, and it's so unstable. And it was, Eleanor agreed, looking her mother-in-law directly in the eye for the first time with no fear, only honesty. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. There were months Liam and I barely saw each other. We poured everything we had into it. There were nights I was so tired I would just sit in my car and cry before driving home. But it was my dream. She spoke with a passion that had always been absent at this sterile dining table. We serve modern American cuisine. We work with local farms to source our ingredients. We change the menu with the seasons. As she spoke, Arthur's smile widened. He looked from Eleanor's glowing face to the forgotten bowl on the sideboard. "Well then," he declared, pushing his chair back. "If that mousse is any indication, I think the city is very lucky to have you." He walked to the sideboard, picked up the glass bowl, and brought it to the center of the table, placing it next to Margaret's half-eaten pies. He then retrieved a clean dessert plate and a spoon. Ignoring his wife's horrified stare, he served himself a generous portion of the pumpkin mousse. He took a bite. He closed his eyes, savoring it. A slow, appreciative nod was his first reaction. "Oh, my. Margaret, you must try this." He looked at his wife. "It's magnificent. It tastes like, well, it tastes like autumn, but new." The entire table watched. Liam's hand found Eleanor's under the table, his fingers lacing through hers. This was more than just about a dessert. It was an offering, a bridge. The question hung in the air, more potent than the aroma of cinnamon and apples. Would Margaret, the matriarch of tradition, be willing to taste a world she had so thoroughly, so blindly, dismissed? Her hand trembled slightly as she looked from her husband's expectant face to the spoonful of her daughter-in-law's success. Margaret's world, once so ordered and predictable, had been thrown into chaos. Her authority, built on a foundation of perfectly browned pie crusts and unwavering tradition, had been questioned not with an argument, but with a simple bowl of mousse. All eyes were on her. Arthur's expectant gaze, Liam's steady watch, and even Eleanor's quiet, newfound confidence. There was no escape. To refuse the mousse would be to admit defeat, an act of open hostility that would forever brand her as petty and proud. With a hand that trembled almost imperceptibly, she reached for the clean spoon Arthur had set out. It felt unnaturally heavy. She dipped it into the light, airy dessert, the delicate foam yielding with a soft whisper. The spoon's journey to her mouth felt miles long. For a woman who had built her identity around feeding others, the act of being fed, of accepting another's creation into her domain, felt like a surrender. She put the mousse in her mouth. The room held its breath. Eleanor watched her mother-in-law's face, trying to read the subtle play of emotions. First, there was surprise, a faint, involuntary widening of the eyes. The complex flavors, the earthy sweetness of the pumpkin, the warm spice of the cinnamon and nutmeg, the sharp, surprising kick of the crystallized ginger on the finish, were clearly not what she had expected from a simple pudding. The taste was undeniably sophisticated, undeniably good. Margaret did not exclaim praise as Arthur had. She did not declare it magnificent. Instead, a complex wave of emotions washed over her face. The rigid mask of matriarchal certainty crumbled, revealing the vulnerable, insecure woman beneath. A single tear escaped the corner of her eye and traced a silent path down her powdered cheek. She quickly brushed it away, hoping no one had seen, but everyone had. She swallowed, set the spoon down with a quiet click, and looked at her plate. "Well," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "it isn't a pie." It was the most she could concede, but it was enough. It was a white flag. It was the acknowledgement that another world of flavor, of skill, of passion existed outside her own kitchen, and she had just been forced to taste it. The rest of the evening passed in a strange, muted haze. The usual post-dinner chatter was gone, replaced by a stilted quiet. Arthur tried to fill the void, asking Eleanor more questions about the gilded spoon, his voice booming with a genuine, newfound respect. Liam answered some of them, sensing Eleanor was still processing the evening's emotional upheaval. Margaret remained mostly silent, tidying up with a mechanical efficiency that lacked its usual triumphant flair. She seemed smaller, her movements less certain. When it was time to leave, the goodbyes at the door were different. Arthur enveloped Eleanor in a hug that was even warmer than his welcome. "I am so proud of you, my dear," he whispered in her ear. "We must come and visit this restaurant of yours very soon." Then it was Margaret's turn. She stood before Eleanor, the remnants of her composure pieced back together, but her eyes couldn't hide the evening's toll. There was no air kiss this time. "Eleanor," she said, her voice low and formal. Thank you for the mousse. Eleanor simply nodded, a gesture of grace. You're welcome, Margaret. The 2-hour drive home was silent for the first 20 minutes. Eleanor watched the dark countryside fly by, the evening replaying in her mind. It was Liam who finally broke the silence. Are you okay? He asked, his voice gentle. A laugh bubbled up inside her, a laugh of pure relief and disbelief. Okay? Liam? I feel like I can finally breathe. She turned to him, her eyes shining in the dim glow of the dashboard. You were amazing. You stood up for me. You told them. I just told them the truth, he said, reaching over to take her hand. I was tired of her not seeing you, the real you. She knows nothing about me, Eleanor said, the reality of it still stunning her. She had a story written in her head and I never fit the part. Well, she knows now, Liam said, squeezing her hand. And Dad is already your #1 fan. He'll have her at the Gilded Spoon within a month, I guarantee it. Eleanor leaned her head against the cool glass of the window, a genuine smile finally reaching her lips. The knot of anxiety that had plagued her for years was gone. In its place was a feeling of lightness, of victory. It wasn't just about cooking. It was about being seen, being respected, and having the person who mattered most in the world stand beside her and declare her worth to everyone. The taste of Thanksgiving, for the first time, was finally truly sweet. True to Liam's prediction, the phone call came 2 weeks later. It was Arthur, his voice booming over the speakerphone to Liam, booking a reservation for 2 for the following Saturday night. A proper date night with my wife, he had announced with infectious enthusiasm. And you tell Eleanor no fussing. We want the real experience, just like any other customers. Despite his cheerful words, a fresh wave of apprehension washed over Eleanor. It was one thing to be vindicated at a family dinner table, a passive victory won through Liam's words. It was another entirely to have Margaret willingly walk into her world, her territory, her creation. The Gilded Spoon was more than a business. It was her sanctuary, the physical manifestation of her soul, built from sleepless nights and trembling hopes. The thought of Margaret's critical eye sweeping over the hand-picked decor, the carefully trained staff, and the menu she had bled for, felt like a final, terrifying exam she didn't know if she could pass. What if she hates it? Eleanor whispered to Liam the night before, tracing patterns on the comforter. What if she finds some tiny flaw, a fork that isn't perfectly polished, a waiter who doesn't smile enough, and holds on to it forever as proof that I'm still not good enough? Liam pulled her close, his embrace a solid anchor in her sea of anxiety. Then she finds a flaw. So what? This isn't about winning her approval anymore, Elle. You already have your success. This is just about letting her see who you are, on your terms. You're not the guest in her house anymore. On Saturday night, the restaurant was humming with its usual controlled, vibrant energy. Soft light glowed from elegant, hand-blown glass fixtures, casting a warm sheen on the dark wood tables. The low murmur of happy, intimate conversations filled the air, punctuated by the clink of wine glasses and silverware. From the open kitchen, a tantalizing symphony of aromas, garlic softening in butter, fresh herbs, the rich scent of searing scallops, drifted into the dining room. Eleanor, dressed in her crisp, professional chef's whites, stood at the pass. Here, she was a different woman from the one who sat silently at Margaret's Thanksgiving table. Her posture was straight, her movements economical and sure, her voice calm and authoritative as she inspected every plate. A little more sauce on the risotto. Plate 3 needs a wipe, she'd say, her eyes missing nothing. She was a commander, an artist, a leader. She saw them the moment they walked in. The host, forewarned, greeted them with a professional warmth. Arthur looked around with wide-eyed, boyish delight, his gaze sweeping from the high ceilings to the bustling kitchen, a huge smile on his face. Margaret was more reserved. She clutched her expensive handbag to her chest like a shield, her expression unreadable as she took in the scene. Her posture was ramrod straight, a stark, formal contrast to the relaxed, comfortable atmosphere of the room. Eleanor could almost feel her assessing, cataloging, judging. Eleanor had instructed the host to seat them at a quiet corner table with a good view of the dining room and to treat them as VIPs, despite Arthur's request. She remained in the fortress of her kitchen, her heart hammering against her ribs, watching through the small rectangular window to the dining room. She watched as they were presented with the menus. She saw Arthur's face light up, but Margaret studied it with an unnerving, scholarly intensity, as if it were a legal document. Through the head waiter's earpiece, Eleanor listened. The lady would like to know if the lamb is from New Zealand or domestic, the waiter relayed. A small smile touched Eleanor's lips. It was a test. Tell her it's from a small family-run farm in upstate New York, pasture-raised, Eleanor instructed, and that we have a photo of the farmer and his dog in the office if she'd like to see it. The waiter relayed the message, and through the pass, Eleanor saw Margaret's shoulders relax, just a fraction. It was an answer a true chef would know. They ordered a 3-course meal, and Eleanor oversaw every component herself, her focus absolute. The appetizer arrived, a delicate, artfully arranged beetroot salad with creamy goat cheese, toasted walnuts, and a drizzle of balsamic glaze. Eleanor watched as Margaret took her first tentative bite. She chewed slowly, her eyes closed for a brief second. She didn't praise it, but she didn't recoil. She simply ate, with a quiet, analytical focus. Next, the main courses. Arthur's seared duck breast with a rich cherry reduction was met with a low whistle of appreciation before he even took a bite. For Margaret, the herb-crusted rack of lamb, cooked to a perfect medium rare and resting on a bed of impossibly creamy polenta. Eleanor watched as Margaret cut into it, her movements precise. She inspected the pinkness of the meat, then took a bite. Again, no grand pronouncement, just a slow, deliberate nod to herself. For dessert, Arthur insisted. We have to try the mousse, Maggie. We have to. Margaret didn't protest. They ordered it to share, along with a decadent chocolate lava cake. When the 2 plates arrived, Arthur dug into the chocolate, but Margaret's attention was on the familiar pumpkin-colored foam. She ate a spoonful, then another. After their dessert plates were cleared and they had declined coffee, Eleanor knew it was time. She took a deep, steadying breath, wiped her hands on a clean towel, and walked out of the kitchen. She approached their table, her chef's jacket feeling less like armor now and more like her own skin. I hope you enjoyed your meal, she said, her voice even and clear. Arthur beamed, pushing his chair back as if to stand. Eleanor, my dear, it was beyond wonderful. It was theater. That duck. I've never tasted anything like it in my life. You're a true artist. Thank you, Arthur. I'm so glad you enjoyed it, she said, her smile genuine. Then she turned her full attention to Margaret. The older woman was looking down at her folded napkin, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She took a moment before looking up, and when she did, her eyes were not cold or critical. They were tired. And in their depths, for the first time, Eleanor saw a glimmer of undeniable respect. The lamb, Margaret said, her voice soft but clear, as if making a formal declaration. It was cooked perfectly, not overdone. The crust was flavorful, not overwhelming, and the polenta was smooth. It's very difficult to get polenta that smooth without it becoming gluey. She paused, searching for the right words, the highest compliment she could muster. You have a very good system here, Eleanor. Everything runs very smoothly. It's impressive. Using the word system, the very word she had once used to dismiss Eleanor in her own kitchen, was a monumental concession. It was Margaret's way of admitting that Eleanor's world had its own logic, its own expertise, its own kind of demanding perfection. It was an apology, wrapped in the only language she knew how to speak, the language of food and execution. In that moment, Eleanor felt the last wall of resentment inside her crumble. She saw not a villain, but a woman who had built her identity and worth on a specific set of rules, and was terrified of a world where those rules no longer made her queen. Thank you, Margaret, Eleanor replied, and the warmth in her voice was real. That means a lot to me. Would you like to see the kitchen? Margaret's eyes widened slightly in genuine surprise, but before she could answer, Arthur was already on his feet. We'd love one. As Eleanor led them through the swinging doors into the heart of her world, the atmosphere shifted. Margaret's posture changed as she entered the domain of heat, steam, and gleaming steel. She watched the focused dance of the line cooks, the way Eleanor gave a quiet command to her sous chef, the intense, beautiful heat rising from the grills. This was a world away from her pristine, silent home kitchen. It was louder, hotter, more dangerous, and vibrantly alive. Margaret watched as Eleanor pointed out the herb garden on the windowsill, her expression softening. She saw not just a daughter-in-law, but a professional. A boss, a chef. The tour ended, and as they stood near the exit, Margaret turned to her one last time. That mousse, she said almost shyly. The ginger. It's a surprising touch. It's my grandmother's secret, Eleanor said with a small smile. A flicker of understanding passed between them. 2 women from 2 different worlds, finally finding a scrap of common ground. That night, after the last customer had left and the staff had gone home, Eleanor and Liam sat at an empty table sharing a glass of wine. The exhaustion was deep, but it was satisfying. "She called your polenta smooth," Liam said with a grin. "From her, that's basically a marriage proposal." Eleanor laughed, a full, genuine laugh that echoed in the quiet restaurant. She said the lamb was cooked perfectly. "See? You won." "It doesn't feel like I won," Eleanor said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "It feels like the war is just over." The relationship would never be one of easy affection, but it was no longer a battle. A bridge had been crossed, and it had been built not with pies or hollow traditions, but with a humble bowl of mousse and the quiet, unshakable courage to finally, unapologetically, be herself.